For most of human history, there was no king, no president, and no single person giving orders to everyone else. For nearly 200,000 years, our ancestors lived in small bands with almost no formal chain of command at all. And yet somehow, decisions still got made, disputes still got settled, and hunts still got organized every single day. So how exactly did a group of humans figure out who would speak first, who would be listened to, and who would be ignored? The answer researchers have uncovered is stranger, more democratic, and more deliberately anti-authoritarian than almost anyone expects. In many early societies, the moment someone tried too hard to boss others around, the entire group turned against that person on purpose. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how leadership was chosen, tested, and sometimes violently rejected in the ancient world. You will also learn why some of the very same instincts that toppled ancient bullies are still quietly shaping your workplace and your friendships today. This is not a story about crowns and thrones, at least not at first. It is a story about smell, storytelling, hunting skill, gray hair, and a surprising amount of group gossip. Anthropologists have spent decades living alongside modern hunter-gatherer communities to understand how leadership actually worked before writing, before farming, and before cities. Researchers studying groups like the Hadza of Tanzania and the Juhonsi San of southern Africa have found strikingly similar patterns across unrelated cultures. These patterns line up closely with what archaeologists find in ancient campsites dating back tens of thousands of years. Later in this video, I will explain why so many hunter-gatherer societies were almost obsessively allergic to bossy behavior. I will also explain how a single skilled hunter could gain enormous influence without ever holding an official title. And I will show you the surprising tipping point in human history when quiet cooperation started giving way to permanent chiefs and kings. Let's start with the biggest myth almost everyone believes about early humans and their leaders. Most people imagine a caveman society run by the biggest, angriest, most physically dominant man in the group. This image comes partly from watching chimpanzees, our closest primate relatives, who do organize themselves around a dominant alpha male. But anthropologist Christopher Boehm studied dozens of hunter-gatherer societies and found something almost the opposite of chimpanzee politics. Boehm called it a reverse dominance hierarchy, a system where the whole group actively works together to prevent any one person from dominating. In practice, this meant that if a strong or aggressive man tried to boss others around, the group had specific tools to stop him. The first tool was simple and devastating: ridicule. If a man bragged too much after a hunt or ordered others around, his own campmates would mock him openly around the fire. Among the Juhonsi San, hunters were expected to downplay their own kills, even joking that the animal they caught was scrawny or worthless. This custom is now known among anthropologists as insulting the meat, and it served a very deliberate social purpose. By forcing successful hunters to stay humble, the community prevented pride from turning into a permanent claim to authority. If ridicule did not work, the group had a second tool ready, and it was far more serious than mockery. Ostracism meant simply refusing to cooperate with a person, excluding them from shared meals, hunting parties, and everyday conversation. For a species that depended entirely on group cooperation to survive, being cut off from the band could be a genuine threat to life itself. If a person still refused to change their bullying behavior, some societies moved to a third and final option. In extreme cases, documented among groups like the Hadza and various Aboriginal Australian communities, the band would collectively decide to exile or even kill a repeat offender. This sounds shocking to modern ears, but researchers argue it reveals just how seriously early humans guarded against tyranny. There's something even stranger almost nobody talks about when it comes to ancient leadership, and it involves how temporary most of it really was. In most hunter-gatherer bands, there was no permanent chief who held power in every situation, every single day. Instead, leadership was almost entirely situational, shifting from person to person depending on the specific task at hand. If the group needed to track and kill a large animal, the most skilled and experienced hunter would naturally take charge of that hunt. Once the hunt ended and the group returned to camp, that same hunter's authority usually ended along with it. If a dispute broke out between two families, an older person known for fairness and calm judgment might step in to mediate instead. If the group needed to decide where to move next, someone with detailed knowledge of water sources and seasonal food might take the lead. This system is sometimes called task-based or situational leadership, and it meant almost everyone got a turn to lead something eventually. Anthropologists studying the Kung San found that leadership roles rotated so often that outsiders sometimes struggled to identify who was actually in charge. In fact, many hunter-gatherer languages had no single word that translates neatly into the modern concept of boss or chief. Instead, they had specific words for the best tracker, the best storyteller, the best peacemaker, and the most respected elder. Imagine a group gathered at the edge of a dry riverbed roughly 15,000 years ago, deciding where to search for water next. An older woman who has walked this land for 60 years quietly points toward a distant line of green trees on the horizon. The younger hunters, despite their strength and speed, immediately defer to her because they know her memory of this land is unmatched. No vote is taken, no order is given, but her word carries the day simply because everyone recognizes where real expertise lies. This scene captures something crucial about ancient leadership, that respect had to be earned continuously, not inherited or demanded. Now let's look at a second major myth, the idea that ancient leadership was purely about physical strength and nothing else. While physical skill absolutely mattered for tasks like hunting large game, researchers have found that social intelligence mattered just as much, if not more. Anthropologists use the term prestige to describe influence that comes from being admired and freely followed, as opposed to influence gained through fear. Prestige-based leaders in hunter-gatherer societies tended to be generous, skilled at storytelling, good listeners, and unusually calm under pressure. A skilled healer or midwife, for example, could hold enormous social influence despite having no physical dominance over anyone at all. Shamans and spiritual specialists occupied a particularly interesting leadership role across countless ancient cultures on nearly every continent. A shaman was typically believed to communicate with spirits, ancestors, or unseen forces on behalf of the entire community. Because illness, bad weather, and misfortune felt mysterious and frightening to ancient peoples, the person who claimed to understand these forces gained real authority. Unlike a war leader, a shaman's power usually came from ritual knowledge, dream interpretation, herbal medicine, and elaborate initiation ceremonies. Archaeological evidence from sites in Siberia and Central Europe includes burials of individuals surrounded by unusual ritual objects, suggesting specialized spiritual status. One famous example is a burial site in the Czech Republic dating back roughly 27,000 years, containing a person buried with elaborate ivory ornaments. Researchers believe this level of ceremonial burial points to some form of recognized spiritual or social importance within that ancient community. But here's what most people don't realize about shamans. Their authority almost always had strict limits placed on it by the group. If a shaman's rituals repeatedly failed to bring rain, cure illness, or predict danger, the community could and did lose faith in them quickly. This meant spiritual leaders had to keep proving their value constantly, much like the hunters who had to keep proving their skill. Let's move to another crucial factor in ancient leadership, one that modern society has almost completely lost touch with: age and lived experience. In a world without written records, an elder's memory functioned as the community's entire library of survival knowledge. Elders remembered which plants were poisonous, which watering holes dried up in certain seasons, and which paths were safe during floods. This form of leadership is sometimes called gerontocracy, meaning rule by elders, and it appears in hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies alike. Among many Native American nations, councils of elders held significant authority over major decisions affecting the entire community. The Iroquois Confederacy, formed centuries before European contact, relied on a structured council system involving respected leaders chosen by clan mothers. Clan mothers, senior women within each family line, held the power to select, advise, and even remove male chiefs who failed their duties. This detail surprises many people who assume ancient leadership was always dominated entirely by men, which was simply not universally true. Anthropological and historical evidence shows women held significant influence in many ancient societies, particularly in matrilineal cultures where descent passed through the mother's line. Now imagine a very different scene, a coastal village roughly 8,000 years ago, facing an unusually harsh and unpredictable winter storm season. The community gathers, and a woman known throughout the village for her uncanny ability to read cloud patterns and wind shifts speaks up. She recommends moving the entire camp inland immediately, despite it being far from the usual fishing grounds everyone depends on. Because her predictions have proven accurate many times before, the group follows her advice without hesitation, and the camp survives the coming storm unharmed. This kind of earned, situational trust reveals how ancient leadership functioned less like a title and more like an ongoing reputation system. Let's talk about rites of passage next, because these ceremonies played a massive role in determining who could even be considered for leadership roles. In many cultures, young men and women had to complete difficult physical or spiritual trials before being recognized as full adults within the community. Among certain Aboriginal Australian groups, initiation rites for young men included extended periods of isolation, fasting, and instruction in sacred tribal knowledge. Among various East African pastoralist groups, including some Maasai communities, young men historically passed through age-based stages tied to specific responsibilities and status. These transitions were not simply about becoming an adult, they were about proving the courage, discipline, and self-control that leadership might one day require. Someone who failed to complete these trials with dignity often struggled to gain the community's trust in future decision-making situations. This is a crucial point that connects directly back to our earlier discussion of prestige. Leadership had to be demonstrated, not simply claimed. There's another mini-hook worth pausing on here, because it changes how we should think about ancient warfare and its leaders specifically. You might assume that during conflict or warfare, ancient societies would naturally hand total power to the strongest warrior available. And in some cases, that is exactly what happened, but usually only for the specific duration of the conflict itself. War leaders in many hunter-gatherer and early tribal societies gained temporary authority strictly limited to military strategy and combat decisions. Once the conflict ended, that same war leader typically returned to an ordinary role within the group, without lasting political power. Anthropologists studying various Amazonian tribal societies found that skilled war leaders were respected during raids but rarely accumulated permanent political control afterward. This temporary authority model helped prevent successful warriors from using battlefield glory to seize permanent dominance over the entire community. So when exactly did this cautious, rotating, reputation-based system start to change into something resembling permanent kings and rulers? Researchers point to one massive turning point in human history, the shift from hunting and gathering towards settled farming, roughly 12,000 years ago. Farming allowed communities to produce and store surplus food for the very first time in human history. Surplus food meant that not everyone needed to farm, hunt, or gather constantly just to survive day to day. This created space for specialized roles, including full-time religious leaders, craftspeople, and eventually, full-time political rulers. Surplus food could also be stored, controlled, and unequally distributed in ways that hunter-gatherer bands rarely allowed. Archaeologists studying early farming settlements in Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent find growing evidence of unequal house sizes and unequal burial goods over time. Larger homes, more elaborate graves, and greater quantities of valuable goods began appearing for specific individuals rather than being spread evenly across the community. This is powerful physical evidence that the old reverse dominance hierarchy, the system that punished bullies and hoarders, was slowly breaking down. Anthropologists call this transition the rise of big man societies, an intermediate stage between egalitarian bands and full hereditary chiefdoms. A big man gained influence not through inheritance, but by hosting generous feasts, giving away resources, and building networks of loyal supporters over time. Unlike a king, a big man's status was not automatically passed down to his children when he died. But over many generations, in certain farming societies, successful big men began finding ways to pass their wealth, land, and influence directly to their descendants. This is the moment permanent chiefdoms began to emerge, where leadership finally became hereditary rather than earned fresh by each new generation. Once leadership became hereditary, the old tools of ridicule, ostracism, and group rejection became far less effective at controlling a ruler's behavior. A hereditary chief no longer depended purely on daily social approval because military power, storage control, and inherited wealth backed his position instead. This is essentially the ancient blueprint for how permanent inequality and dynastic power eventually took root within human societies. There's another layer to this story that rarely gets discussed, the role that consensus and group discussion played in nearly every major decision. Many hunter-gatherer societies made important choices through long, often nightly, conversations around the fire rather than through a single person's command. Anthropologists studying the Juhonsi Sand documented lengthy discussions where every adult, including women and younger members, was allowed to voice an opinion. These discussions could stretch for hours, with the group circling a topic repeatedly until something resembling agreement finally emerged. This process looked slow and inefficient to outside observers, but it produced decisions that almost everyone in the group felt genuinely part of. Because everyone had a voice in the discussion, there was far less resentment afterward, even when the final decision wasn't everyone's first choice. This consensus-based approach also meant that no single person could easily manipulate the group into a decision that only benefited themselves. Imagine a tense evening around a central fire, where two families disagree sharply about whether to move camp before the rainy season begins. One elder speaks first, calmly laying out the risks of staying near a river that has flooded suddenly in past years. A younger hunter counters that the current location has far better game, and moving now would mean weeks of difficult searching. Other voices join in slowly, some agreeing with the elder, others raising practical concerns about the very old and very young in the group. There is no vote, no single decider, but through repetition, patience, and mutual respect, the group gradually settles on a shared plan by nightfall. This kind of decision-making required enormous emotional patience, something modern societies, with their fast meetings and quick votes, often struggle to imagine. Let's look at one more region that offers a fascinating variation on ancient leadership, the islands of the Pacific and their chiefdom systems. In parts of Polynesia, including ancient Hawaii, Tonga, and Samoa, leadership existed on a spectrum between the egalitarian bands and the hereditary kingdoms we discussed earlier. Polynesian chiefs, often called alii in Hawaiian tradition, held real hereditary authority, but their legitimacy still depended heavily on generosity and ritual performance. A chief who failed to redistribute food during hard times, or who ignored sacred obligations, risked losing the loyalty of the very people he ruled. Anthropologists studying these societies describe a concept called mana, a form of spiritual power and prestige believed to flow through a legitimate, effective leader. If disasters, failed harvests, or military defeats struck repeatedly under a chief's rule, people often interpreted this as a sign that his mana had weakened. This belief system created an unusual kind of accountability, where supernatural explanation and practical politics were tightly woven together in the public imagination. There's something even stranger almost nobody talks about here, the fact that failed leaders in these systems could sometimes be quietly replaced by rivals within their own family. This reveals that even hereditary chiefdoms, which we often imagine as rigid and unquestionable, still carried echoes of the older reputation-based systems that came before them. Let's also consider a detail from North America that adds even more nuance to this picture: the structure of the Iroquois Confederacy's Great Law of Peace. This system united 5, and later 6, Native American nations under a shared council structure designed specifically to prevent any single leader from dominating the others. 50 representative chiefs, called sachems, sat on the Grand Council, but crucially, clan mothers held the power to nominate and remove them from office. If a sachem behaved selfishly, ignored the community's needs, or abused his position, the clan mothers could formally strip him of his title. This built-in system of accountability, existing centuries before European ideas of democracy arrived, shows how sophisticated ancient checks on power could genuinely be. Some historians even argue that concepts from the Iroquois system influenced early conversations among framers of the United States Constitution, though this remains debated among scholars. Now, let's return briefly to something we opened this video with: the idea that we have lost touch with these ancient checks on power. Modern psychological research actually supports the idea that humans still carry deep instincts favoring fairness, reciprocity, and suspicion toward overly dominant individuals. Studies on group dynamics repeatedly find that people quickly resent leaders who take credit unfairly, hoard resources, or refuse to listen to group input. This resentment mirrors, almost perfectly, the ancient tools of ridicule and social exclusion that once kept hunter-gatherer bullies in check. In many modern workplaces, employees still instinctively undermine or quietly resist managers who behave like self-appointed authorities without earning genuine respect first. Researchers studying organizational behavior often note that the most effective modern leaders resemble ancient prestige leaders far more than ancient dominance-based bullies. Generosity, competence, calm communication, and consistent fairness still predict long-term trust and cooperation, whether you are running a band of foragers or a company. Let's bring together everything we've uncovered about how ancient humans actually chose their leaders across thousands of generations. For the vast majority of human history, leadership was situational, temporary, and tied directly to specific skills like hunting, healing, or peacemaking. Bands actively used ridicule, exclusion, and in extreme cases, banishment to prevent any single person from becoming a permanent dominant authority. Prestige, not raw physical dominance, tended to determine who was listened to and followed within these ancient communities. Elders held enormous respect because their memory functioned as the community's entire archive of survival knowledge before written language existed. Shamans and spiritual leaders gained influence through ritual expertise, but had to continually prove their abilities to maintain the community's trust. Rites of passage tested courage and discipline, helping determine who the community would trust with responsibility later in life. War leaders gained temporary authority during conflict, but this power usually disappeared once the fighting ended and normal life resumed. Everything changed with the rise of farming, food surplus, and eventually hereditary chiefdoms that replaced situational leadership with permanent inherited power. The instincts that once kept ancient bullies in check have not disappeared, they still quietly shape how we judge leaders, bosses, and public figures today. Perhaps the biggest lesson from this ancient story is that leadership was never meant to be permanent, unquestioned, or free from accountability. Our ancestors seem to understand something we sometimes forget in the modern world, that real authority has to be earned again and again and again. If this glimpse into ancient leadership changed the way you think about power, authority, and human nature, consider subscribing for more forgotten history like this. There are dozens of other ancient practices, rituals, and survival strategies that reveal just how sophisticated early human societies truly were. Leave a comment below and let us know which ancient leadership tool surprised you the most: the ridicule, the exile, or the rotating authority. And if you'd like to see more deep dives into ancient wisdom, prehistoric survival, and forgotten human history, make sure to like this video and share it with someone curious about the past.